delighted to be chairing the session and want to express my deep thanks to the SWAP Collective for putting this whole colloquium together. I think it's been absolutely remarkable so far. And, you know, I've also been so impressed by the way the SWAP team has really pulled together and are in an exciting and coherent way are carrying forward Prashani's insights. And I think the way Prashani constituted the SWAP group and the wonderful way in which they operate collectively is one of her many legacies. So this is, for me, very special to be part of this colloquium. So the session today, Remembering Freedom, sort of carries through this theme of remembering, whereas the session this morning was focused on the 2015-16 movements. Today's session opens up to a broader set of issues. Two of the presentations are on South Africa. One is on Lebanon, Palestine, and one is on a historical movement in India. And I think that what was established yesterday and to some degree this morning was the whole process of remembering also having a sort of a critical comparative dimension that sort of lets us reflect on what's going on in South Africa in relation to other parts of the world, as well as vice versa. So the first speaker today is Sophie Chamas, and her presentation is titled The Return of the Militant Intellectual, Study Revolutionary Affect and the Will to Resist. Sophie is a senior lecturer in gender studies at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies at University of London. Their research explores the life, death, and afterlife of the radical political imagination in the Middle East and its diaspora. So,
has not connected yet. I'm sorry, I should have told you that.
Okay.
So we can start with Frida and that group.
Oh, okay.
They're
All
online, and then yeah.
Okay, so
sorry about that.
This will be a talk called Commemorating a Revolution. And the participants are Frida, Robles, Ponce, Kunika, Kharat, Thomas, Crowley, and Ujjwal, Kanishka, Utkarsh. They are collaboratively working on the artistic research project Commemorating a Revolution Yet to Come, funded by the Austrian Science Foundation and hosted by the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. Their research engages with feminism in urban India, the politics of memory and historicization through performance, the Dalit movement, anti-caste philosophy, urban geography, political ecology, the intersections of politics and artistic practice, and artistic research through cinema. And hopefully this will all work.
Hello, thank you very much for having us. We're just going to start the video. We'll play a video along our texts. And yeah, sorry for the recent one. Okay. Mahad, a small town in Maharashtra, holds a very special place in the imagination of the anti-caste movement in India. This was the town where the historical leader of this movement, Dr. Ambedkar, started a civil disobedience resistance, Satyagraha, on the 20th of March of 1927. when he led thousands of Dalits to drink water from the Chavdar tank, the water that we are now observing, which was normally forbidden to the so-called untouchables. As a reaction, people from the upper castes ended up beating up Dalits who participated in this rally, but it didn't stop there. Brahmins filed a litigation to secure the tank for themselves in an attempt to legalize untouchability. What I will now read is a fragment from the Kurt summary of the lawsuit that Brahmins filed against Dalit activists following this event. We read this 100 years later, and we wonder, what has changed? What stays? Exhibit. In the court of the second class sub-judge at Mahad, regular civil suit number 405 of 1927, claim. 1. The plaintiff, touchables, sue to have a declaration that the Chavdar tank, situated at Mahad within the jurisdiction of this court, that they alone have a right to the user thereof, that the defendant, untouchables, are not entitled to use the same, and that injunction should issue against them not to use the suit tank, alleging inter alia that the Chavdar tank was constructed hundreds of years ago before the advent of the British government, that it is surrounded on all its sides by strips of land owned by private individuals, that the touchable Hindus own houses round about the suit tank, that the touchables have been using the said tank from times immemorial, that the untouchables have never used it, that the said tank is not a public one, but is a private property, originally constructed by some private individual for the use and enjoyment of the touchable communities, that the municipality of Mahad began to supervise the said tank from the sanitary point of view, that touchables who own the surrounding site put up the embankments for the suit tank so far as their sites are concerned, that they also have constructed flights of steps to the suit tank in order to approach the water therein, that there are only two untouchable communities at Mahad, namely Mahars and Chambars, that they reside in different and detached localities, that there are municipal wells for the use of these communities, that according to the Hindu religion and the Shastras thereof, the Hindu society is really divided into two classes, namely touchables and untouchable, and that this classification is also supported by the customs or usages obtainable since times immemorial, that these two classes cannot meet and hence the untouchables do not use suit tank, that the untouchables, however, started a movement in March of 1927 to do away with the custom and to force an entry into the suit tank, that they succeeded on one occasion, which resulted in a fracas between the two communities, as the religious feelings of the touchable community were wounded, that the suit tank had to be purified because of the pollution caused by the entry of the untouchables, that the untouchables threatened to re-enter the suit tank, that the rights and privileges of the touchable community are thus jeopardized, that the religious feelings and sentiments also stand in danger of being wounded, that the touchables learned of the determination of the untouchables to effect an entry into the suit tank in November 1927, when the cause of action accrued, and hence plaintiffs sue for declaration and injunction. After losing this case, the Brahmins appealed the judgment, resulting in a legal process that lasted over a decade. Despite dismissing their appeals, the court did not address the issue of untouchability. Dr. Ambedkar wrote that the civil disobedience that started in 1927 was stopped as the Dalits placed their hope in the legal system to restore their rights, which did not happen, at least not then. The Chavdar tank struggle was and is not only for water, Ambedkar stressed.
Today, Dr. Ambedkar's statue stands right in the middle of the Chowdar tank, witnessing the everydayness of Mahad and also the annual commemoration of the Satyagraha. These are the residue of this commemoration, what's left behind of it the next day. We are working on the artistic research project Commemorating a Revolution Yet to Come, which revolves around the Dalit movement and reflects on it 100 years after Ambedkar's Satyagraha. Despite the strides made by the Dalit movement, caste system and caste-based oppression continues to be a reality in contemporary India. In this context, we want to ask as to what does a revolution mean and what does commemorating mean, especially commemorating a revolution, which we argue is yet to come. It is an attempt through cinematic, textual, and curatorial practices to go beyond the binarity of the celebration or rejection. It is rather an attempt to be with it in all its complexity, its flaws, its achievements, its critiques, without reducing it to an understandable, explainable, linear narrative. So we keep visiting Mahad. On our most recent trip during the monsoon this year, we started the major part of the production work. As part of the process, we met multiple people from the Dalit community around the town. We wanted to have conversations about Mahad, about the Satyagraha, the 100 years of it, about the life now, about life in general, about caste. Some of the comments that came in these conversations really surprised me. We were told that casteism does not exist anymore. It was all eradicated after the Satyagraha, they said. Everyone has access to water, they said. Everyone does have water connection now, a tap in every house. During this trip, we took up a flat in one of the two Dalit settlements of the town, Bhimnagar, named after Ambedkar's first name, Bhimrao. There are hardly any shops around here. All the new cafes, restaurants, eateries, they all have opened in different parts of the town, but not in Bhimnagar. A small shop which seemed to have every necessity for the day-to-day is run by a woman who lives here. But even here, we were told that revolution is done. Ambedkar did the revolution. I wonder if it's just coincidental that when it rains heavily, as it often does in Mahad, Bhimnagar is usually the first to flood. It is all okay, they say. They know how to deal with the floods, they say. This is also the same Bhimnagar where two collapsed houses stand, collapsed during the floods of 2021. Thousands of people from the Dalit community visit Mahad from all over Maharashtra every year for the celebration. They settle themselves in either a community rest house in Bhimnagar or in the parking lot of the memorial building for Ambedkar in the city center, or under the sheds created at the places of commemorative importance. People take plastic bottles filled with water from the tank with them, the holy water that it has become. Despite thousands of people celebrating, it still remains an isolated affair, confined to the specific sites and the roads connecting these sites, while the rest of the town continues to be. The woman selling flowers at the entrance of Chavdar tank told me how she forgot a packet of rice in the train that she had packed to cook. It was enough for 3 days of her stay. Every year she comes and sells flowers at the same spot for 3 days. She also sleeps at the same spot. When this cleaning is happening, she is long gone. For the free bus tickets are only available until the next day of the event. The joyous parades and the tidy proclamations sit uneasily together. A confident faith in eradication, shadowed by the account of who still gets soaked, who still rebuilds, who still picks up the pieces, and who cleans up after the celebration, lingers in the air.
The field you're looking at, known as Kranti Bhumi, or the land of revolution. This is it where Dr. Ambedkar convened his followers on December 25th, 1927, in the sequel to the March 20th action. It is here that Ambedkar compared the Mahad protests to the French Revolution. It is here that he burned the Manusmriti, an ancient Hindu legal text that codified gender and caste norms in a brutally hierarchical way. In 1927, the population of Mahad was about 8,000. Its geography was typical for a town of that region. A concentrated urban core, largely populated by the so-called upper castes, with scattered neighborhoods for oppressed caste groups around the edges of the town. Between these settlements lay fields of rice and patches of grazing land. After the dramatic events of March 1927, Ambedkar and his colleagues put an enormous amount of energy into organizing the December follow-up. But initially, no one was willing to give land for this conference of untouchables. Finally, a Muslim landowner named Fateh Khan agreed to make his grazing land available for the conference. Huge tents were set up. Water had to be purchased because untouchables were still not allowed to access public water supplies. Organizers anticipated that roughly 6,000 people might show up for the December conference. In the end, over 10,000 people showed up, more than the population of the town itself. The conference was, in the words of anti-caste radical Anand Teltumure, the first collective articulation of civil rights for Dalits. After that, the land remained under the ownership of Fateh Khan's family. 50 monsoons passed by, inundating the grazing land, then turning it into an impenetrable thicket of grasses, bushes, and flowers. 50 winters passed by when the thickets were cleared through brush fires or through cutting, and grazing resumed. 50 summers, as the grasses became dried out, scorched by the burning sun. As the 50-year anniversary of the Mahad Satyagraha approached, Ambedkarites began to plan for a grand commemoration. As part of this, the People's Education Society, an organization set up by Ambedkar to provide education to Dalits and other oppressed groups, arranged to buy the land, now known as Kranti Bhumi, from Fateh Khan's family. They built a giant pillar known as Kranti Stambh, the revolutionary column, with a flame at the top representing the burning of the Manusmriti. A portion of Ambedkar's ashes, kept from his cremation after his death in 1956, were installed underneath the statue. Since then, every year on March 20th and December 25th, huge crowds gather at Kranti Bhumi. Now, 100 years approaches. Ambedkarite journalists write articles accusing the People's Education Society of neglecting Kranti Bhumi. The People's Education Society itself has split into at least 4 warring factions, mirroring the fragmentation of the post-Ambedkar Dalit movement. On March 20th, different stages are set up for rival political leaders. Outside the days of Ambedkarite commemoration, Kranti Bhumi returns to its everyday rhythms. It is a cricket ground, a site for morning or evening walks, a parking space for school buses bringing students to see the historic sites of Mahad. Every year, in the punishing monsoon rains, it floods. Every year, before the December 25th commemorations, workers clear the overgrown thickets and grasses, and the cricket games resume.
These are images of the Buddhist monastic caves just on the outskirts of Mahar, taken this summer when the temperature was hitting almost 45 degrees. There were even small forest fires in some of the hills in the mountain range, which surround Mahar and give it its unique saucer shape. These images have been taken on 35 mm color positive film. Somehow, having a physical form projected directly seemed apt for this inanimate witness which has been standing there since more than 2000 years. It has seen all in a way, and much more than just the last 100 years of Mahar which we have been talking about. It would have seen the Maratha kingdom, the British colonial era, the post-British colonial era. It would have seen Ambedkar come to Mahar, and the chemical industrial corridor being set up close to the city. And then the never-ending highway construction, which has now been under construction for almost 2 decades now. And now, over the past few decades, it would have witnessed itself becoming a site of pilgrimage. We are using different kind of cameras for these images, pinhole cameras, SLRs, rangefinders, and we have been able to develop the film at our production base in Mahar. This was especially challenging during the monsoons. It was all damp and wet with rain, with the rains going on for months and months. These caves have seen countless seasons come and go and are still in quite a good condition. They have become part of the pilgrimage for the Dalit community, which commemorates Ambedkar's radical action in Mahar on the 20th of March and 25th of December. Ambedkar initially had a tendency towards modernity and looking to the West as a tool for emancipation for the Dalit community and for change in the Hindu customs. With decades of trying to fight this, in the latter half of his life, he seemed disillusioned by any possibility of achieving any change while being in the Hindu fold. Although he did not give up on the ideals of modernity, he increasingly looked towards Buddhism. He famously said that although he was born a Hindu, he wouldn't die one, and stuck true to his word, converting to Buddhism. Especially in Maharashtra, the Dalit community sees conversion to Buddhism as an important part or aspect of the anti-caste movement. And in the recent past, more and more, the Dalit discourse has looked at the emergence and recognition of Buddhist caves all around as a sign for the glorious Buddhist past, perhaps even as a counter to the glorious Hindu past, something which the Hindutva right forces insist on. But even beyond the realm of the Dalit discourse, these caves adjacent to Mahar have a life of their own. Through the year, you will see people climbing up the caves, some as a pilgrimage, some just out of curiosities, sometimes a school kids trip, and sometimes just as a makeout spot, to be able to hide from the city and surveilling eyes. We also often climb up to the caves. One of the favored times to do that for us has been really early in the morning, around 5 or 6, to avoid too many people, to do it in peace and take our time, to get the beautiful sunrise light which falls directly on the caves. And also because the Archaeological Survey of India, or ASI, rules dictate that a tripod can't be used without prior permission. But well, nobody is there early in the morning to check, so. During one of the recent early morning climbs, it was just us and some dogs. A bit later, there were 2 guys who had their helmets with them. Presumably, these guys had been riding through the night. When they climbed up, we were already there. As we were going around shooting and recording, these guys were checking out, peeping into different caves there. Many of the caves have now been doored up and locked in by the ASI, so you can't go in. I think we were generally impressed by the bikers coming in so early. About an hour or so later, on our way down, we saw in one of the open caves next to the steps, those 2 guys asleep and one of the dogs asleep on the floor. They really must have been driving through the night and needed to crash. We tried to walk past them quietly and went down for our typical routine of having chai and some breakfast at the entrance of the steps. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to the group for that powerfully effective presentation. And I think the use of visual images and narrative was wonderful, and the 4 presentations tied together in a wonderfully coherent way. And there were sort of 2 issues that sprang to mind as I was watching it. The one is the whole question of caste and race. And in 2001, there was a huge conference in Durban around racism, xenophobia, but also caste. And at that moment, I think there was very interesting ways in which Dalit activists connected with other groups, especially anti-racist groups in South Africa. And the second thing that sprang to mind as I was watching is that, of course, Ambedkar was the author of the Indian Constitution. And, you know, in very interesting ways that brought back Lindo Kuchle's critique of the South African Constitution. And it seemed to me there's some sort of potentially interesting reflections, mutual reflections that might be had around that. So who's next? Okay, are you okay with yes, going then? Okay. So Thatshisiwe Ndlovu will be giving a paper titled and you need this, okay. Revoicing Freedom, Refusal, Anger, and Fantasies of Violence. She's a postdoctoral fellow at the Narrative Inquiry for Social Transformation, or NEST, at WITS. Her work centers on the lived experiences of trauma, exploring how individuals navigate its enduring emotional, social, and political effects. Her scholarship interrogates the dynamics of violence, relationality, everyday life, and the intersections of gender and voice. She holds a PhD in development studies from the University of the Witwatersrand, and her research focused on the multifaceted concepts of violence, subjectivity, and indigenous cultures. And Ndlovu has held posts as a researcher at Public Affairs Research Institute, or PARI, as well as as a research fellow at SWAP. So thanks, Thatshisiwe.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. I'll be presenting an article that I co-authored with my postdoc mentor, Jo Bradbury. She's a professor in the Department of Psychology. And the title of the paper is Revoicing Freedom, Refusal, Anger, and Fantasies of Violence. So I'll just read something, and then I'll go into a discussion or into an explaining how we get to some of the arguments in this paper. This is an excerpt from a woman who was part of the research that they undertook, which I'll explain in a bit. I'll just read it. When a white person says "futsek," I can also say "futsek" and not get arrested. Yes. Look, this takes me back. The story of Solomon. Yes, Solomon Mahlang. It takes me back straight to the whites when they killed him and did everything. If I could, I would get in and hit them. And when I look, they are hitting him and kicking him. That's not a lie, not a lie. That's how they killed him. But we are still saying we want this, that we blacks are stupid men. Yes, we see If I had power, I would fight. I would get soldiers and kill all white people. Laughing, I get angry. So in this article, we invite you into the reflections of older generation Black women in dialogue with their grandchildren's generation of what freedoms and unfreedoms look like from their perspective in the context of both apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa. And understanding gendered freedoms and unfreedoms involves recognizing the complex intersections of gender with other intersecting social categories like race and class. And if we go back to how dominant narratives of freedom emphasize, they emphasize racial reconciliation and the idea of the rainbow nation. They emphasize forgetting, forgiving, and moving on through the TRC and the rainbow and the process of actually moving on in this country, or the reconciliation and peacemaking. But lived experiences of freedom, and this is what we put up, like we try and argue in this paper, that lived experiences of freedom and unfreedom remain contested. Freedom is typically imagined and packaged as a positive way of being, linked to desire and hope. However, for those dealing with trauma and injustices who do not have the luxury of positivity, freedom may be imagined, understood, and experienced differently. So we argue that political freedoms after 1994 don't fully capture the affective, psychological, and embodied dimensions of freedom for people whose voices were historically silenced. So the paper asks, how can we know and tell of freedom of the silenced when their emotions have been repressed, their voices denied, and memory erased? This question aims to uncover the ways in which politics is embodied in personal life histories, to explore the affective dimensions of history that are often silenced and invisibilized. So we examine how older Black women articulate freedom and unfreedom, I think as I've already said. And we explore refusal, anger, and fantasies of violence as expressions of freedom, bridging feminist theory and feminist and narrative theory to understand affective dimensions. So what I would emphasize is to note that we are not simply cataloging trauma, but we are trying to see how these women reclaim subjectivity and voice through their emotions, the emotion of anger and imaginative acts, which we call fantasies of violence. So we engage for our analysis and understanding of the narratives that we have. We engage Black feminist thought on the politics of refusal predominantly. And we look at refusal through Tina Kamp's idea of quiet refusal, which is a rejection of the status quo as livable and the creation of possibility in the face of negation. But looking at refusal as a deeply creative, sustaining, and forward-looking process of reimagining freedom. We also engage anger as a generative and expressive force, because we know that anger has been dismissed as a minoritized and marginalized feeling. And through Lord links refusal to self-preservation, asserting that recognizing and valuing anger is vital for agency and resistance. And Tina, in her latest 23, A Black Gaze, she offers a more refined analysis of affect for grounding how emotions in refusal and resistance acquire meaning beyond their immediate expression, generating new possibilities and ways of being. And for our methodology, we use the concept of Sankofa, the African concept of Sankofa, which talks about revisiting and reclaiming historical experiences that are erased, ignored, and bringing them into the present. So we try and look at refusal as creative through Tina's conceptualization or theorization, anger is political, fantasies as symbolic reworkings of power, and Sankofa is a methodology of bringing the past into the present. So I'll just briefly explain how this article comes about. So next, through, I think with the Prof. Peggy Peterson and Jill Bradbury, they commissioned a study that they called Older Generation Grandparents Study. So this grandparent study looked at the older generations of people in conversation with the people who would be their grandchildren, not necessarily biological. So the interviewers were the age of people who would be these people's grandchildren. But then we look at it in the people that were interviewed were older people who were alive during apartheid, and who have lived like almost at that point in 2019, between 2017 and 2020, had lived almost 20-something years in post-apartheid. So they collected narrative interviews, these young interviewers and older people, and these created an intergenerational co-construction of memory in the present. And so I inherited this corpus of data, and I was supposed to do something about it, and hence reading through the data or the narratives, I noted something about it, that is almost a refusal of the silencing of the idea of forgetting and moving on and closing chapters. And I got very interested in how these people speak back to that dominant narrative and to the silencing of their own voices and emotions in a way. So, so the findings of the study, really we put them into different themes. So the first one, literally, it talks about freedoms and unfreedoms. So it, the argument that we put forward is freedom is not just legal, it's not just political, but it's personal, it's affective, and it's relational. So older women resist being cast as voiceless victims. They reclaim the right to speak. And they push back against the idea, the Rainbow Nation silence that demands reconciliation over recognition. And I'll present a few quotes that really show the tensions that the narratives show that have to do with political gains versus everyday unfreedoms. Yes. So one of the women say, hey, it was tough. Me, being black, you would find a boa spitting on you and you can't talk back. If you talk back, you can even get a rope. You would die. And someone says, during those times, yes, you see black, back then, we thought that's how life is. You couldn't question, but it was hard. It was hard. It was very, very hard. So here we were trying to show that during apartheid, it was very difficult for people to speak or to express their emotions. And they even talk about that, like getting a rope means you can get killed if you were to express express your anger or any form of emotion that is may not be acceptable. And I think one thing that I can highlight is that the women that we talked to mostly were women that were working as either domestic workers. They had a very close proximity to white people and their families. So they were either domestic workers, farm workers, or low-level office workers during their time. Some of them were still working, but some of them had retired. But it was an issue of them expressing that then we couldn't express our own emotions, but now in the post-apartheid, we are free to express our emotions, and freedom to us is the idea that we can now say futsek and not get arrested in that sense. So the other theme that we discuss is the idea of refusal and anger. So refusal, it's the rejection of imposed narratives of silence, accommodation, and forgetfulness. So there are many other narratives that we get where you see that they talk about these families, and there is that idea of, yeah, you have to accommodate others through the idea of the rainbow. We have to accommodate, we have to be forgetful, we have to forget the whatever happened to them. But for them, instead of forgetting, instead of accommodating or being silent or trying to move on in silence, they project anger. And we look at anger not as a pathological emotion, but as valid, as expressive, and as a form of resistance. So the emotions that were suppressed during apartheid now becomes tools for reclamation. So the participants narrate their anger as part of their freedom, even when society expects them to be calm and forgetful or forgiving. So as a way also of refusing to forget or to be calm or forgiving, one woman, when asked, what do you remember about apartheid? She says, Hector Peterson, they carried him, he got shot. You know, when it's June and the TV shows those things, I get crazy. Seriously, it shows a white person will never like a black person. In Mokopane, they fed black people dead. This happened in Mokopane. So apartheid ruined lives of black people so much. We still work for whites, but not because they like us. They fear the law. A white person will just kick you out, even if you did nothing wrong. Someone talks about apartheid. Oh, I just hate the poor. They hate our parents. They beat them. They did a lot of things, and I hate them. Even now, it looks like the country is about to go back to them. No, they would oppress. So this was when Jacob Zuma was the president, and that's where also the study is situated. So we talk a lot. We try and situate the study within the context, but I think for the sake of this presentation, there are a lot of things that are falling out. But yeah, and there is also the idea of fantasies of violence, where it's really fantasies of retribution towards white people that emerge in these narratives. They are not necessarily literal calls to violence, but they are imaginative symbols, symbolic acts of justice. We argue that these fantasies function as fugitivity, refusing normative emotional regimes and reworking power relations really between them and their employers. So in expressing anger, these women tend to alternative, invisible forms of resistance, which are these fantasies. So they are not to be read as violent edges, but as expressive, imaginative acts that speak to injustice and misrecognition. So some of the fantasies that we had, yes, if I had power, I would fight, I would get soldiers and kill all white people. I get angry. This is the part of the excerpt that I started with. And the other one talks about how when they were protesting outside a church in the Eastern Cape, they were calling on magic to hurt white people, because I think in that situation when you do not have the power or the guns, you can always resort to what you have. So the narratives, like all other narratives in this article, they involve really a rewriting of history in which powerlessness and unresolved anger about the injustices that these people endured and their families are repackaged in a fantasy of violence. So these are the, in short, that's what the paper is about. So we theorize emotions as political. Anger, fantasy, refusals are theorized, or we see them as embodied resistance. And there is also that we note the tension between recognition and reconciliation. The women demand recognition on their own terms, not imposed forgiveness. And there is also the idea of memory and possibilities, revisiting the past to revoice the present is a part of the way in which people reimagine what could be possible outside of what we were told is the only way of attaining freedom. So we also talk about the limits of accommodating dominant discourses, e.g., for example, healing narratives. And this article contributes to broader debates on post-colonial feminist narrative theory about how marginalized subjects articulate voice, affect, and agency. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So thank you so much. That was a really very powerful presentation. Yeah, what really jumped out for me was this concept of Sankofa, of revisiting the past in order to rethink the present and move forward into a different future, which seems to capture very powerfully the idea of remembering and really, hold it. And, the second related to that was the whole question of the possibility of uses of anger. And you used this phrase, possibility in the face of negation. That just seems to me like a wonderfully productive set of questions to follow up on. So thank you so much, Thatshisiwe. So Sophie is online now, right? So I've already introduced Sophie. Shall I go ahead and do it again? Or? Okay, all right. So Sophie's on next.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry. I got the time zone completely mixed up, and I thought the talk was in an hour. But I'm here now. But I'm sorry for having missed the other presentations. So I'm going to be talking about a book project, basically themed around revolutionary debt, that takes Lebanon as its case study, given its rich history of now marginal leftist militancy. So this concept of revolutionary debt or indebtedness is something I've been thinking about for a while, and I'm now developing with my comrade Basim Assad, who isn't here today, but who I met in a Marxist reading group in Lebanon years ago when I was still a PhD student. So we're still in the early stages, and we're still having exploratory conversations. So this might feel a bit rudimentary and disjointed, but I want to use my time to introduce this idea of revolutionary debt, which I think at least might help those of us desperate to figure out how to keep agitating against the horrors of our present, and eager to figure out how to maintain a commitment to futurities that feel increasingly impossible. So what I'll do with the time I have is introduce this idea of revolutionary indebtedness. So I have, over the last 2 years, been thinking obsessively about what we owe the dead, about debt and how cultivating it might be politically fruitful. So we normally understand debt as something that stifles us. Might debt, however, be something that enlivens us, enables us, and propels us forward, that gives us a sense of purpose and allows us to instrumentalize despair and transform it into mournful militancy, to borrow from queer theorist Douglas Crimp. So this project builds on a growing body of work on Arab left melancholy to argue that a melancholic engagement with the revolutionary past need not be generative of paralysis, pragmatism, or worst of all, reaction in the present, but can paradoxically be productive of a recommitment to the promises of projects of social transformation reconfigured as unfinished or unfulfilled rather than deceased. So by turning backwards and cultivating a sense of indebtedness to and responsibility towards vanquished and subsequently neglected political ancestors, can contemporary leftist and progressive actors in the Middle East challenge and denaturalize the limitations that material conditions have placed on their political imagination and the directions of their organizing in our present conjuncture, characterized by a sense of hopelessness in the face of seemingly unbeatable foreign imperialism, local despotism, and the genocidal climax of Israel's settler colonial project. So the project turns to the forgotten or neglected ghosts of the vanquished from Lebanon's history of revolutionary leftist militancy to ask what might come from cultivating a relationship of indebtedness to these political ancestors. So how might that reconfigure our approach to organizing in the present and towards the future? And it thinks through the political potentiality of actively conjuring the ghosts of the vanquished for imagining beyond the limitations of what feels possible within our present conjuncture, examining what sociologist Avery Gordon calls haunting as an ethico-political praxis that can aid in challenging defeat as structure of feeling for the left in Lebanon and the Arab world more broadly. So the project examines figures and, by extension, political practices and subjectivities that have been made to feel bygone and irretrievable, lost objects and subjects from another time and place, the militant intellectual, the striking working class laborer, the revolting peasant, the transnational revolutionary communist. It considers what might come of reorienting towards these figures and their ways of being political in the world, exploring the insurrectionary potential of a melancholic engagement with them in a manner that, rather than resulting in despair and a pining paralytically for what was and can never again be, can be reinvigorating by affectively inspiring a recommitment to derailed and unfinished revolutionary projects. So by turning towards the past in such a manner, we argue that contemporary progressive political actors are better able to assess the potentialities and limitations of available political opportunities and movements. So in the time I have left, I just want to flesh out this concept of revolutionary debt a little bit by discussing one of the figures that we will focus on in this project, and that's the figure of the militant intellectual. So when walking the streets of Beirut, Lebanon, the capital city of Lebanon, one is likely to encounter the stenciled face of the Lebanese Arab Marxist Hassan Hamdan, better known by his pen name of Mehdi Amel, who was an active member of the Lebanese Communist Party. This image is often accompanied by the graffitied exhortation to read Mehdi Amel. Mehdi Amel, who was assassinated in 1987, lived through, agitated against, and theorized about a conjuncture ostensibly distant and distinct from our own. Why then do the walls of Lebanon continue to demand that we read Mehdi Amel? What is there to be gained from returning to or picking up for the first time the work of the militant intellectuals of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and of connecting to their militant ethos? Among the two of Amel's articulations that are often repeated is the expression, how can the revolution be unsoiled when it is born of the present and soiled by it, before demolishing that present and washing itself with the promise that the human is beautiful and free? For a growing number of leftists in the Middle East, the ability to view the present as soiled and to develop a revolutionary politics of contradictions without a resignation to an ahistorical understanding of what resistance has, can, and should look like, is being cultivated through an engagement with the likes of Mahdi Amel and their work on how to make sense of, navigate through, and eventually demolish the present. Crucially, this involves a refusal to accept that the horizon for emancipation that once felt possible is no longer achievable or worth fighting for. This can be understood as what Jonathan Flatley, building on Walter Benjamin, frames as politicizing splenetic melancholy, a mode of clinging to things from the past, which enables interest and action in the present world, and is indeed the very mechanism for that interest. So something that struck me when reading the anthropologist Fadi Bardawil's 2020 book, Revolution and Disenchantment, Arab Marxism and the Binds of Emancipation, is that despite remarking that many of the questions that preoccupied the 1960s and 70s generation of militant intellectuals have regained intellectual and political relevance in the wake of the Arab revolutions and the global anti-capitalist mobilizations, Bardawil insists that the political conjuncture they inhabited and acted in, and the answers they articulated exclusively in a Marxian idiom before abandoning it, is not exactly ours today. Similarly, the historian Samir Frangieh, writing specifically about Mahdi Amel, argues that his world and ours are not the same. His concerns and ours have diverged, and our theoretical landscape makes his interventions sound outdated. But is the political conjuncture we inhabit really so different, as Bardawil and Frangieh argue, to that occupied by Amel? Or are we living something more akin to what Sami Hirmez, in the context of Lebanon, refers to as continual war? Continual because, as he puts it, the roots are the same, although they do grow and adapt. In most contemporary writing on the Palestinian militant intellectual Ghassan Kanafani, contra the work of scholars like Frangieh on Mahdi Amel, there is an insistence on the continued relevance of his analysis. Amongst the many enduring interventions of his that people point to is his insistence that ruling regimes in Arab countries were doing everything in their power to help curb and undermine the Palestinian mass movement. Building on Sami Hirmez's work, I would argue that psychoanalytically and affectively, the sense of a reactionary continuum generates a feeling of stuckedness for those of us in the present, often communicated through the debilitating relational expression, "we are still." But this sense of an undefeated past of reaction enjoying its continued prominence in the present needn't generate a sense of hopelessness or incapacity. Instead, it can and should encourage a return to neglected modes of not only analysis, but imagination and habitus. Of the two Mahdi Amel quotes that have echoed through the decades, the most beloved and repeated, especially today, is "You are not defeated as long as you continue to resist." In a piece on Amel's legacy for N+1 Mag, Basima Saad writes, "We return to these words before we turn to face the world." Where and how do we derive the affective capacity to remain steadfast and carry on when living in a time of ruination, a time defined by death? Figures like Amel, I argue, inspire the cultivation of a politically productive left-wing melancholy in Enzo Traverso's sense of the term, an obstinate refusal of any compromise with domination. For example, in a preface to his recent translation of Mahdi Amel's The Path of Revolution is Our Universe, written 42 years ago, Lebanese-British doctor Ahmed Al-Amin writes in relation to current Israeli fantasies of reoccupying Lebanon. For us, the future seems to be uncertain, and indeed much of it is. One thing is certain, however, they will be defeated. Al-Amin derives his certainty from Amel's words, drawing on what he frames as Amel's unwavering intellectual clarity, even amidst war, and unyielding political militancy, even in seemingly desperate times. Indeed, upon reading the intent to assassinate him printed in the pages of a weekly newspaper in Lebanon, prompted by his eulogy at the funeral of Hussein Mroué, another assassinated Lebanese Communist Party member, Amel spent weeks walking around and sharing the death sentence with his wife and friends, and as Basima Saad writes, laughing maniacally in a gesture of defiance in the face of what seems to have felt at the time as an inevitability, given Amel had no intention of going into hiding or retreating from political life. He was shot with a silenced gun on Algeria Street in Beirut, a profound place for the fall of the militant intellectual whose heart, as his wife wrote, was seized and torn at by the Algerian Revolution. Amel, Ahmed al-Amin argues, in the face of defeat and hopelessness, did not falter in his commitment to and belief in Lebanon as a bastion of resistance, and so neither should his contemporaries on the Lebanese left. To the Israelis, Amel wrote defiantly, "You are the dustbin of history, and Beirut is the city of the free who have made a vow. We will resist you." There is something to be said for not wanting to let your political ancestors down, for not wanting to fail the dead, to believe that so long as you resist, you are not defeated. To believe in what Amel said and what he practiced is to believe that regardless of the outcome, resistance is an end in itself, a necessity in itself, a universe in itself. What I am trying to think through here is the political potentiality of cultivating a sense of belonging to and kinship with, and by extension, a sense of loving indebtedness to our revolutionary ancestors, and the ability of this affective orientation to reshape our organizing in the present and help us cultivate a belief in and commitment to a political otherwise. I'm trying to think through the utility of cultivating a sense of responsibility towards what we can conceive of as ghosts, whose analyses and positionalities continue to productively haunt us, and how this might inspire a desire, need, and even urgency to follow through on what they started. And I'm trying to argue both for the importance of thinking with the present resonances of analyses and strategies from ostensibly bygone moments, but also for the importance of particular modes of affectively relating to those who articulated and lived these analyses and strategies. So just to end, what kind of Arab political subject might emerge in the aftermath of the genocide in Gaza? Can the horrors of the past 2 years and the shape that resistance has taken to them refashion political subjectivity in the region? For this to happen, I think we do need to return to the past, not through melancholic romanticization or what Hannah Proctor calls moribund nostalgia, but rather via an embrace of political nostalgia, an engagement with revolutionary history that harnesses the energies of past experiences for the present. So I'm interested in thinking through the political utility of cultivating indebtedness as a productive affective dimension of the social reproduction and evolution of leftist political and social movements in the Arab world. As Enzo Traverso argues, left-wing melancholy needn't involve unending mourning over a lost and irretrievable object, but can manifest as a re-engagement with and rethinking of socialism in a time in which its memory is lost, hidden, and forgotten and needs to be redeemed. Perhaps one of the ways through which to cultivate a productive left-wing melancholy is by embracing and nourishing a relation of revolutionary debt, to sit with and think through what we owe figures like Mehdi Amel, who lived their theories and died for them. So Enzo Traverso reminds us that for Walter Benjamin, revolutionary movements were nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than liberated grandchildren, and that the sight of the vanquished is always critical, that remembering the vanquished is a necessary component of revolutionary struggle. So I'm trying to argue that we owe it to figures like Mehdi Amel to think through how to reinvigorate the project of and for a socialist, anti-imperialist, socially just Arab world. And I'm trying to think of figures like Amel and other revolutionary ghosts as in the vein of Traverso, the vanquished actors who await redemption. Thank you very much.
Sophie, that was a great presentation and very provocative, but also I think like Thatshisiwe's presentation sort of tied powerfully into the remembering movement's theme that we're so focused on. And, you know, as you were talking about Mehdi Amel, of course, the person, one of the ancestors who springs to mind for us is Fanon. And it also occurred to me that they have a sort of there's another ancestor with whom they are connected. There's a wonderful book by the Ghanaian intellectual Ato Setiotu on Fanon and the dialectics of experience, in which he calls Gramsci a precocious Fanonian. And I seem to remember hearing that Mehdi Amal is often called the Middle Eastern Gramsci. So, you know, it seems to me tracing some of these lineages could be a really interesting way of engaging the remembering movements. So is Asisipho online? Okay. So Asisipho Solani is going to give a paper titled African Challenges Necessitate Indigenous Solutions. Consequently, progress in resolving these issues has been slow. He comes from the Eastern Cape, Fort Beaufort, but currently resides in Cape Town in the Western Cape. He taught African politics, the political economy of Africa, and the African political evolution of the African state at the University of South Africa. He's also teaching political science and international politics at Ujjwal College. He holds a BA degree, honors in political science, and master's degree in political science, and is currently doing a PhD at Rhodes University. His research interest is African political thought, African politics, revolutionary theory, and the liberation movements in post-independence Southern Africa. So, Asisipho.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I hope I'm audible, Chair. Can I get a notification?
Yes, you are. You are.
All right, thank you very much. I think I'll just want to ask for forgiveness. I'm coming down with flu, so from time to time I might be coughing and sneezing, and I hope I'll try to minimize that. I think the theme itself is very interesting and critical, because it provides us with a base of trying to understand where we are today, but having a historical journey that we must go back and try to locate ourselves. How do we get where we are today? And I think it gets to be located within the theory that I would have attempted to deploy in trying to understand these doing a comparative analysis between the Zimbabwean context and South African context, and in trying to understand the impact of the colonial project in the post-independence Africa, and path dependency theory makes us understand that there are certain discussions, there are certain issues that are within the post-independence period, but for you to understand those decisions, you'll have to go back and locate them in the history. And I think that becomes critical for us. And the comparative analysis is critical because it's two liberation movements, two countries that are close to each other in terms of their geographical location, their politics, their economy. The countries generally are interlinked, and the liberation movements themselves have been really in support of each other in terms of fighting the liberation struggle. So perhaps the vintage point would to attempt to look at colonialism itself as a project, and when we move, we narrow it down to the liberation movement and the implications on each. It was the project itself, how it played out in the continent, it played out in various ways, just even across the world, not only in the African continent, and how liberation struggle was fought and how independence was attained becomes critical and provide foundation in terms of the post-independence phase, and how there are certain things that will intercede and move from one historical account and move beyond to the post-independence, that particular transition. And the interest is to look at the post-colonial period and whether really the liberation movements have been able to transform from being liberation movements to the post-modern governing political parties that this day and age requires to run these independent countries, these independent states. And that is where we are trying to draw our debate in trying to understand and say, what do we do to resolve these African challenges that we are facing today, that we have not been responding rapidly and responding to these challenges? I mean, it's beyond 30 years of democracy, but in the context of South Africa, there's still a number of challenges that we are facing that are structural. So what is that we then have to do as South African people? If we just look at the context itself, on the concept of colonialism itself, it's generally around countries that, whether it's a foreign country, Western countries, that would want to take control and dominate certain countries. And there's a particular rationale and the reason beyond that. It's one, it has to do with the mineral resources, it has to do with the agricultural products, it has to do in trying to enrich the colonizers. So it is about a particular, it's an economic project. It's not a mere exercise to just to expand. There is a particular project that the colonizers have. And in a nutshell, I'm going to rely on Mahmoud Mamdani on this. Mahmoud Mamdani speaks on two concepts. He speaks on the direct rule and indirect rule. So he speaks of the centralized despotism and the decentralized despotism. Sorry. And this sort of control gave power to foreign countries to be able to impose their domination in order to able to establish their organized repression. So the repression would bring various developments, such as destroying the cultures of the indigenous people and also exploiting the indigenous people. I mean, Cabral makes that argument in 1970. So therefore, colonialism gets to unfold in various ways. It is brought by having a colonizer settling in a particular country, coming in and being able to attempt to run the affairs of the country directly themselves. The other context you have is you have colonizers that would want to make use of the pre-existing traditional governance structures that have been appointed by the people, or whether it's traditional leaders or native rule, be able to impose use those infrastructures to be able to run their own project through them. And in the process, of course, there's a domination in terms of the thinking, there's a domination in terms of the narrative and the ideas. And various colonial powers like the French in your West Africa would have attempted to use what is called assimilation, where they will enforce the people, the native people, to learn the language, to be able to learn the traditions, and ensure that these people begin to identify themselves. To a certain extent, in other countries, there were African people that spoke French better than the Frenchese people, that the African people that understood the French traditions more than the French people originally from France. So this gets to play out. But in the context of in the context of South Africa and Zimbabwe, these are British colonies, and we would expect to see how they get to play out in terms of the South African context. Now, the South African context becomes very interesting because you've got a debate between the British and the Dutch in terms of they were fighting who gets to control and run South African context. And that is why, even when you look in the liberation movement literature, they will speak of what is called colonialism of special type, where they speak of the colonized people and the colonizers living together in that particular environment. So you've got a settler-colony arrangement. And in some cases, and you have to manage these contradictions. And of course, the arrival, the colonial project, immediately from the onset, got to provoke the native people. From the onset, if you read Lulu Kalinako's, makes a point that within the first 3 months of the arrival of the Dutch in the Southwestern Cape, there was a resistance from the Khoi people. So the liberation struggle began to start as a phase to oppose and resist the colonial rule. And it took various forms in the different parts of the continent. There were others, though, you will pick up, there will be your traditional revolutionary, classical revolutionary, where there is physical confrontation, a war. So, in the other instances, you will pick up that there's a more negotiated settlement around attaining independence. And but we begin to see African getting independence post-Second World War, in the 50s, where many countries from the Ghana, 1957, 1956, attained their own independence. But what we're trying to bring across is that how independence got to be attained would have played a role in terms of how things happen in the post-independence period. Because there will be an event when there's settlement and agreements, it would mean that there are certain decisions that had to be taken to ensure that there is a smooth transition on it. However, there are critical concepts that gets to be raised by Fanon, where he makes a call that there's a use of violence, and language understood by settlers is violence. He further says language understood by natives is violence itself. So, but at the center of the liberation struggle was about attaining political freedom, self-determination by the African people. Self-determination becoming important, that they must be able to say who must govern us, how do we want our country to proceed post-independence. There are various number of political liberation movements across the continent. In Zimbabwe, it's ZANU-PF. In South Africa, you've got the ANC, you've got the PAC, there was Frelimo as well in Mozambique. So these are the liberation struggle that was organized to ensure that there's a resistance, and they were working together coherently. And what brought them, or what I would say is similarities or commonalities in the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF was formed by a group of ethnicity of the Shona people that organized themselves. And that was a breakaway from the ZAPU, who was founded by Joshua Nkomo, who was predominantly on the Ndebele speaking. In the ANC, we're an ANC that was formed in 1912 in Bloemfontein by Christians that felt that there was a need to fight resistance. And of course, this is informed by the 1910 formation of the Union. That is also informed by the 1906 rebellion, the Bamata rebellion. So all these instances and historical moments, they move in a particular fashion from one phase to another as we get ultimately to the 1948 decision of having South Africa as an apartheid state. So now, we are moving from this particular context, and the liberation in Zimbabwe went through a classical revolution. There was a war in Zimbabwe. There was bloodshedding in Zimbabwe. That led ultimately to negotiations that took place in Lakansta. In the context of South Africa, there was a strong resistance as well. South Africa, there was a formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe in 1961, where there was a decision to enter into an armed struggle, moving away from what would have been understood as a passive resistance. Now, along that particular period, there's a which is very important, around 1955, South Africans sit together and consolidate a document and have a conversation nationally where people were making contribution in various, they were writing in the toilet papers, matches boxes, tree trunks, to say the kind of South Africa they want and envisage. And the document came out of the Freedom Charter. That then became a founding document, a strong backbone policy document of our own democracy, and it underpins our own constitution as well. Now that is a critical moment that South Africans take ownership of this particular document and the kind of society they envisage. Now we move towards independence. South Africa gets to be one of the countries that attain independence, 1994. And what we would have been able to pick up is that there's a concept of democracy. And around the 1970s, there's a number of countries that are attaining democracy. But democracy, is it really understood within an African context? Because it's a foreign concept itself. Because Zimbabwe itself was not clear. It was not outright a democratic state. You can't argue it was outright a democratic state, because from the 1980, the onset, the leadership of President Mugabe was very clear in terms of how they respond to different and divergent views. And predominantly, they would have pushed to have a one-party system that is able to run the affairs of the country. In the South African context, you've got a multi-party democracy. You've got the decisions that are taken, negotiations to say, how do we transit from one level of regime to the new regime? Of course, having learned some lessons from other various countries in terms of how you manage the transition. learn from the lesson, not to have the bloodshedding, not to have civil wars. We've seen civil wars right across the continent. We've seen the impact, the economic instability. We've seen infrastructure demolishment in terms of these wars. So war became very, very expensive. It became necessary to have a negotiated settlement. And then we'd have some sunset clauses and to say, what is that we can do? What is that we cannot do? But let's be able to work together. Now, you move to a democratic society where there's independence and leadership from the colonial or the liberation movement warriors. Now they get to come in. Of course, the first thing you pick up, there's a question of leadership capacity, whether they are prepared, they are ready themselves to run the affairs of the country, whether they were prepared sufficiently is another question. You take it further, and there's also internal conflicts. The question of the inzals and the exiles in the South African context. Who gets to be entitled? There's a level of entitlement from liberation warriors that we have this responsibility to run the affairs of the country, and we must lead because we were in exile. We fought for the liberation. On the other hand, we had people that were in Robben Island, and again, if you look in Zimbabwe, there's consistently leadership must be the war veterans. It's the war veterans that must be at the pinnacle. Now, that question as well in terms of the internal conflicts within the liberation movement. Now, what you pick up, there's a strong colonial imprint or legacy that we still in the post-independence, both South Africa and Zimbabwe and other African countries. There have not been much in terms of tempering the infrastructural and the structural imposition and policy position. We've not been able to transfer economy completely to the hands of the majority of the people. There are a number of issues that have not been, there's beautiful policy positions that we pick up. But the critical question is the question of implementation. How are we not able to yield positive results from these particular policies that are so good that we have worked together? That all agree that these are good policies. And the fundamental question we must ask is, why is that the case? And again, what we pick up in the democratic dispensation, now whoever the leadership question becomes an opportunity for everyone that has means to contest political power. And for those that are able to amass resources to contest political power, they get an opportunity to be at the pinnacle. But whether their vision and where they want to take the country is aligned with the policy positions of the liberation movement, it's something else. You then have a question of leadership deficit, the leadership problem that you are facing. There's a lack of moral fiber among the leaders, those that view themselves as people that must be at the pinnacle. Two, those that were in the liberation struggle, they don't want to hand over power. Others feel that there was bloodshedding. We can't hand over power through a vote. Now, what becomes critical in the question we ask ourselves, brotherhood in terms of these liberation movements, what is that they talk about when they meet as liberation movements? Peer review programs. Are the leaders of the continents able to call each other to order and say, but President so-and-so, what you're doing in this country is not correct? Is there a clear understanding of what democracy means just for all of us? Do we have policies and monitoring evaluation mechanisms in various countries to be able to assess that what we have committed to, are we able to do it? Do we have a clear plan of fighting some of the challenges that are coming out strongly? Corruption, there's a strong question of corruption right across the continent. That there's a use of state resources for people to drive their own narrow agendas. Now the question is, are there any plans that are saying this is a plan that these liberation movements have to respond to the corruption question? Because at the center of it, at the expense of it, are the people, the poorest of the poor that are expecting services. And the question is a question of capacity, is a question of appetite or willingness to do it. Are there any consequence management processes within our governance structures from these various countries? And how effective are they if they are there? And we see these challenges playing out. It requires that the African people themselves should be able to sit down and say, what is that needs to be done now that we've transcended from the post-colonial period? We find ourselves, we have a neo-colonial project playing out now. How do we respond to that as the ordinary African people fight these challenges that we're fighting? And what we've been able to establish as well, there's a clear electoral decline from the participation of the people. There's no willingness from the people to take a part in terms of democratic processes. In the context of South Africa, the electorate, there's a decline, there's a steep decline from 1994 coming down in terms of our people having confidence in our democratic processes. And it must not be understood only in the context they don't have confidence only on particular political parties, but they don't have, they're losing confidence in the political democratic processes themselves. And we must be able to answer that question. So the fundamental question or the critical question, as I sum up, that needs to be responded to is what needs to be done? Africans themselves in these various countries need to take a particular stand, active citizenry, that will come together and say, these are the challenges we're facing, which are pretty clear. Everyone has a sense of the challenges that we're facing. But there needs to be a position to say, what is that we do effectively in society? One, to hold our leaders accountable. Clearly, it's difficult for themselves to hold each other accountable. Two, to ensure that what we have been promised in terms of the manifestos coming to reality. If not, what do we do to make sure that we punish those that are not doing what is expected? So the crucial question, there must be a consolidation, like the Freedom Charter 1955, a necessary dialogue of the African people to say, what are the challenges we're facing? What do we do moving forward? And they make sure they hold leaders accountable. I think let me pause there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asisipho. And, you know, I think a number of the points you were making could very productively be brought into conversation with Thatshisiwe's analysis of anger and the possibilities of anger being brought to bear in these conditions. So at this point, our presenters have been very disciplined. We have half an hour for discussion. What I would ask you to do is to sort of, instead of long speeches, sort of reflections such that we can enter into conversations with one another and with the presenters. So could I see some hands? Okay, 1, 2, 3. Do we have a 4th? Okay, so 1, 2, 3, and then others who want to come in, I'll open up again.
Thank you. I have 2 questions. Sorry, I can't ask my first question without using an example. I was recently at a book launch of a book called Death in Pretoria that talks about sort of unpacking the stories of all the people that were killed for political reasons or were hanged for political reasons in Pretoria. And the author tells the story of one particular village in the Eastern Cape where the entire village was going to be arrested, but obviously it would be impractical to kill all of them. And so they had certain people who were leaders decide who was the most involved. It was a very traumatic experience. And that community in the Eastern Cape still carries that trauma because they were involved with, you know, a sabotage incident, and that's how it came about. So I was just wondering, Thatshisiwe, your research focused on individuals, right? How could this method be applied to a collective psyche, like a community that experiences a traumatic incident like that? And then the second question I have is, what does the intergenerational co-construction of memory that you refer to, what does that actually look like? And if I could also just ask Sophia to also answer that question, what does intergenerational co-construction of memory look like? And how does one then use that to fight the continual war that she was talking about? Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Thank you so much, man. And I'm always comfortable when I'm standing. Hey, it's a long story, but I'll try to shorten it, like you said, Chair, that to time constraints. It's a comment And the comment is coming to you, my sister, Thatshisiwe Ndlovu, ne? And the last will be the last speaker. Thanks for the wonderful presentation. And then when you spoke about the situation being encountered by people who are in the domestic sector, I don't know, you reminded me of something. During the old establishment, the old government, there was an act which was called Domestic and Master Servants Act. So that act was prohibiting, let's say if you are an employee, especially in the domestic act, domestic sector. Let's say, for example, your boss or your madam is not happy with what you did, and you try to defend yourself. You go maybe to the extent of going to CCM. By that time it was labor, not CCM, because CCM just came now in 1994. So you as a worker, you were going to be found guilty, even if you were not wrong. The commissioner will tell you that no, you were not supposed to answer back to your employer. You know the act is like this, even if you were not right, you were not wrong. So you were quoting from the Domestic and Master Servants Act, which is still prevalent in some ways, although it was abolished from the apartheid books. Why am I saying so, my sister? From my personal experience, having worked in the hospitality and leisure industry for more than 22 years, that act is still there, although it was abolished. When I was a shop steward there for 7 years, we used to go and defend some people at the labor there, at the CMA now, simply because they were dismissed, because maybe the client who came there, remember that place I was working for was one of the I won't mention it, one of the big brands in South Africa and throughout Southern Africa. So where you could have customers with deep pockets who could come and book a hotel, a room. By then, when I was working, 5,000 rands per night, they could pay for 14 days. Let's say if you're a domestic worker working there, and then this client does not like you or is not happy about your performance, okay, about your performance, and they says to the owner of the management of the hotel, no, I don't like this face. You could be summarily dismissed. So we used to challenge that. Right, so coming to my brother there, this is very interesting, the story I'm talking about the liberation movements in Africa. And I saw you were concentrating especially about Southern Africa here. It's very interesting to see what is happening these years through these liberation movements. If you look around, some of those liberation movements, you speak about SWAPO, Frelimo, some they've been voted out. Now you singled out these two other liberation movements, like in South Africa, ANC, and Zimbabwe there. You are quite all right. My question to you is, what do you think is making these liberation movements to be flawless, flavorless? Yes, they liberated people, but if you look at the people now, it's like we have got a new generation now, not that old generation. And especially in the case of Zimbabwe, where the ZANU-PF there, the records have shown that they've lost elections several times, but they still don't want to go out of office. So what's your take about what's happening in South Africa here, especially taking into consideration that the very same friends from Zimbabwe, South Africa and Zimbabwe, we're seeing quite a number of people coming to South Africa because of the situation that side is not favorable. But the comrades, do you think sometimes when they do meet, do they even discuss about to say, comrade, what you're doing is wrong. Please put your house in order so that the people won't experience such much exodus of people. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, my comment and question is I'm gonna tie Asisipho and my sister Thatshisiwe there on the paradoxes of anger and contaminated memory, looking into Transkei and Zimbabwe nostalgia, because as the Gukura Hundi between 83 and 87 was happening in Zimbabwe, something similar was happening in the Transkei. And I'm basing this on the fact that you will always have certain people that are in the same level of trauma as everyone else, but they will actually pick out the nice things that were happening in these states. So if you look at the tyranny of Matanzima and the tyranny of Mugabe, for instance, you'll find Shona and Xhosa people that are saying, despite what was happening around us, we had benefits. Times were, things were better under Matanzima. But politically, these were tyrants that were suppressing anything. So I think I'm basing this because of the literatures that came out of these, states. For instance, in Zimbabwe, you'd find writers like Yvonne Vera who paint a different narrative of the first, second, and third Chimurenga in Zimbabwe. And the characteristics of, Zebra and Zapu soldiers that were at war, but villages were caught in between. So I'm wondering that, could it be that we are still having this very deep nostalgia about oppressive spaces that keep on reproducing these contaminated memory traits, particularly in family lineages and so on? Because if I were to go to my mother who worked during apartheid as a nurse, and I ask her how are things now compared to then, she'll openly say things were better under Matanzima at the time as compared to now. So how do we then also mediate in terms of the new literature forms that are informing, these very, like these gaps within the memory traits and trails of, these people that come from these very hostile histories?
Also, somebody online has a question. So why don't we take the question online, have the participants respond, and we then should have time for another round of questions.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if I'm audible.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I think my first question is with Dr. Ndlovu regarding, especially when she talks about domestic workers. Did in terms of her research find out maybe the one that employs the domestic worker was living a double life in terms of when they're at home and with the domestic worker is treated nice, but because they are white, once they get outside, they treat another black person that is not their employer wrong, or else the domestic worker lives in fear in their house, and then at least when they're at home, it's a freedom. So that is my question. And for Dr. Solani, because he speaks about indigenous solutions, and specifically with South Africa and Zimbabwe. And I would like to ask him, in terms of, is it a matter of how the things that are changing in terms of the liberation movement? Is it the way because they've got the power, they were never ready? And does he think in terms of what is happening in Zimbabwe, Mozambique, in Congo, does those need indigenous solution, or the solutions that have been, the negotiations that have been happening are correct, or do we really need the indigenous solutions? Thank you.
Thanks very much. So, Thatshisiwe, why don't you go first, and then we'll go to Asisipho and then to Sophie.
I don't know if I'm going to answer the question. I'll try and respond and then take some as things to think about. I think the first question was, how could this methodology method apply to a collective? So it's something that I think when the paper went for review, it came back and we were pushed to try and make or apply this to a broader collective. But then we found it very difficult to do that because we did not have enough data to push it to apply to a collective. Hence, we insisted that we stick to the individual expressions of freedom. And if maybe there is money or time, then that could be something that will be explored. But I would not really want to push it there now. I don't have enough evidence for that. But I think the fact that you raised it again, I think it's something that we need to talk about and maybe research on. So thank you for that. And then the idea of intergenerational co-construction of memory, how does it look like? From this research, the idea was to try and invoke a conversation between the younger generation and the older generation on what they expressions of or what freedom looks like to them, to the older generations, and try to create that kind of atmosphere where there is that communication between the older generation and the younger generation, and the idea was these different generations shape and create a shared understanding of the past. So because it's called Old Grandparents Project, and it came out of an understanding with Joe's honor students that they really did not have an understanding of what exactly happened in apartheid, and their identities were couched as post-apartheid or born free. So there was that. Yeah, I think that's how the idea came about, if I'm understanding it well. I didn't understand well the question on contaminated memory. Yeah, so yes.
So when you are now approaching someone like that, this person will always remember, you know, the nice things on certain days, but then this person at the same time will snap, and now that is incurred to the next generation, and the historical pattern of it all is a dedicated sense of thought.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think for me that's a new concept that I don't really have much knowledge on. But the idea really was not to get facts of what happened in the past or to have a very, you know, that linear narrative of what happened, but it was a way of trying to keep some of the conversations alive and to record and keep some of the stories from this generation that is passing. So we were not really looking at, is this factual or it's not factual? And the fantasies of violence that come up are more like a call or a bid for retributive justice, because there is a general feeling that we really were shortchanged with the acceleration to healing. So that frustration, I think, comes in these fantasies of violence. But I wouldn't say these fantasies of violence would translate to real violence towards people. That's my interpretation of the data. Yeah. Thanks.
So, Asisipho, would you like to respond to the questions?
Thanks, Chair. I think the beauty about a colloquium, it's a conversation. We've all got the responsibility to respond to the questions collectively. And then I'll attempt to make a contribution towards in attempting to respond to the questions that are raised by the colleagues. And I think we'll start with the first colleague. And a true fundamental point that is raising. It's true that Zimbabwe, there's always been a consistent issue around the elections and how the elections outcomes turn out to be. There's a concept called competitive authoritarianism. It's a very new concept, but competitive authoritarianism plays out beautifully in Zimbabwe in this way. You seem to have democratic structures that are there at a face value, or for where we're looking, we see these structures, these elections, people that are saying they're free and fair elections. But when you begin to go deeper in trying to understand the mode underneath, that attempts to make sure that the outcomes of the elections or the outcomes of the democratic processes are viewed in particular way, but the outcomes turn out to be in a particular fashion. So that has been the case in Zimbabwe in terms of there's a clear voice of people saying that we want new leadership, but the elections tend to come out in a particular way. Now, what do we do? It will take the Zimbabwean people to be able to make up the call and say what is that they need to do themselves. If it's a classical revolution that must happen, that's the case. And critically, there is an African peer review mechanism. And the question we all ask ourselves is that what is that these African leaders say when they speak and discuss and having these peer review debates? That what is that they are saying to you're a dictator, this is what we are doing? Are they really able to call each other into court order? Recently, there was a summit when liberation movement in Southern Africa that came to South Africa. They were in Johannesburg in a summit for 4 to 5 days. And the fundamental question is, there's quite a number of things that are going wrong in these various countries. Are they responding to these issues? Are they calling each other into order? Unfortunately, it's a conversation that really the mechanism needs to improve to be more effective. But clearly, they've not been much effective from where we are standing and we're looking at the African countries and how things play out in these various countries. And the second speaker, I want to take us a bit back. The conceptualization of the decolonial project. The debate around what is decolonialism? What do we do? This is a question that the Nkrumahs and the Sheikh Anta Diobs of this world were trying to help us in trying to understand the African Renaissance and say, what is decolonialism? Others were saying, what do we do? Do we take away everything that came with the colonial project? Do we use what was working? Do we go to pre-colonial Africa? Now, that debate becomes important. But there were other scholars that were raising issues in saying, not everything that would have existed in a colonial project is something that is wrong. We ought to take what was working and be able to bring it to where we are today and see what is that is going to work for us. And material conditions tend to dictate, and then conditions will not be the same. So I'm saying, of course, the Matanzima, your Mugabe regimes, because of the nature of the problems, because dialectics teaches us that the world is not static, there's dynamics, there's changes. So the nature of the problems gets to change from time to time. It requires different solutions. So what was applicable in 1994, pre-1994, might not be the case in post-1994. So the point I'm trying to make is that there would have been things that were working within those regimes that were as brutal as they were, that the current leadership is not able to respond to. And the nature of the regimes as well play out. What a particular regime has its own modus operandi and mechanism that differ. So if you have a democratic society, there are things that you can't dictate. There are processes that you ought to follow, which might be patriotic decisions that you have to take as government. But if someone is unhappy about that, you have to protect those particular rights. But in a different state, you can be able to impose. It might be patriotic, but so they differ from time to time. To the last colleague, of course, the question of each regime has its own challenges and opportunities. There's opportunists. There are people that want to find something out of it. Of course, leaders, African leaders, would have the necessary capacity to lead post-independence. I don't think that should be a debate. The question of capacity is not even an issue of a debate. But the issue is, are we able to have systems that are holding each other accountable? One. Are we having systems to make sure that what we are saying we're going to do, we have done? If not, what is that then as citizens are we doing to hold those that are in power accountable? However, so the dialectics will teach us that from time to time, we're going to evolve. We must be able to sharply adapt to those conditions. Let me pause there. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, because we're... So the question is whether we have time for another round. It's, yeah? Oh, yes, Sophie. Oh, sorry. Yeah, we should bring Sophie.
Oh, yeah, well, I'll keep it very short. So I think the question was on the co-construction of intergenerational memory and what this looks like. I mean, part of the problem in Lebanon, at least in the post-Civil War period, is that when it came to activism and political organizing, the kind of self-critique was always that it was always like starting from scratch or starting anew, and there was very little institutional memory, because also the actual kind of archives of the left, a lot of that was lost during the Civil War, the 15-year Civil War itself. So I think what's happening now is that people are trying to recover lost material and lost narratives, be that through doing oral history projects with people who were part of workers' unions in the 70s, or translating and creating anthologies of the work of Marxist intellectuals who aren't being engaged with. So I think it is about, I think that's why I find the lens of haunting and ghosts quite useful, because it is about kind of returning and excavating and archiving and then disseminating work that that hasn't been accessible for a long time. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thanks very much. Are there any online questions?
No, but I have one.
Okay.
When you take the hands.
Other questions? Okay, 2, 3. Do we have a 4? Okay, Taz, go ahead.
Okay, that's very loud. Thanks. I am first gonna spotlight the room. Sorry, multitasking now. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this panel's been great. I think really should have been titled Walking with Ghosts or something like that. But I think it's also really interesting because it worked, like all of these presentations work with the concept of remembering in different ways. And was just chatting with Simon about, where the idea of remembering movements came from. And I think Ahmed traced some of this yesterday. But also Prashani's work around Derrida's use of memory, inheritance, and generation. And I think there's really useful links here between that work, concept of rememory, ideas of, dealing with ghosts and hauntings. So my question is really to the 2 online presentations. And it's quite broad, so I guess anyone on the panel can answer it. But it's really quite directly, what does some of this tracing, revisiting, excavating, remembering histories, different histories from different periods really, how does this help us to think about potential futures or potential yet to comes? Thanks.
Clear. Who is this directed towards? Oh, okay.
The group presentation and Sophie.
Oh, okay. Thanks. Okay. Number 2. Go.
My question is directed to Asisipho. By the way, my name is Peggy Kuzwayo. Asisipho, we were still on the liberation movement. are we likely to see these liberation movements die one day because of their performance? You look in the way they've betrayed their people, their voters, their constituency, especially here at home. Are we likely to see the ANC lose the vote and die? President Kgalema Motlanthe once said, in order for the ANC to renew itself, it must die and lose an election. Are we likely to see that one day? Thank you.
Number three, third question.
Okay, greetings to everyone in the room. My name is Likaya, and my question basically is directed to Sophie. So basically, I'm having this kind of like a memory when you mentioned the return, the word return. I like when you use that because I'm thinking of the analogy that is in line with like water, as in the element in the ocean, going back and forward, return and backward, like a balance of some sort. So I just want to know what is the litmus test for this return? How do you measure it? Is it measurable? How do you know that this is the return? And because it has something, linking to memory and remembrance, I guess. So how do you measure that?
Okay, thank you. And the fourth questioner, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Zenon Ndaisenga. I think mine is not going to be a question, but it will be a comment to Asisipho Solani. He stated that African liberation movement, in transitioning from liberation groups to governing political parties, and the comment is actually most of African countries, they could not reach what Frantz Fanon termed as genuine decolonization. So that is why those political, governing political parties, most of them, their cadre are them who form what Fanon called the bourgeoisie class. So it is the same bourgeoisie class which continue to work on behalf of the colonizer. Therefore, I may say that, yes, maybe a direct colonization has disappeared, but the indirect one, it is still alive. So if we check what happened, for instance, in China with Mao Zedong, when he launched the liberation movement against Japan. So far now, if they assess, they found that at least they can see that there has been an improvement. And they are reaching what I was saying, the genuine freedom. So most of African countries then, they reached the flag independences or negotiated independence. Reason why, after when they gained on power, they could not do what they were fighting for. So that's why I may say that colonialism actually it's not over, but it is all over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I suggest we do the following. We start with a group of four. because Taz's question was directed both to them and to Sophie. So we go from the group of four to Sophie to Asisipho.
Thanks. I mean, for us, I think looking back is also in a way looking back as a reflection and then also as a critique of the movement or the revolution is also to be able to say that it can be better and to say that the revolution has not, well, even in the title of the project or the presentation, it's commemorating a revolution yet to come. And we definitely, it's also this position that it will come and it is not yet done. And it, for us, at least with the Dalit movement, I feel like this thing becomes quite in binarity, either a celebration or a complete rejection of it. So looking at these inanimate witnesses also is very interesting, and to be with this moment of a revolutionary moment, if I may call it, like in this particular instance. But it is also like in a previous work of mine, we were following a rally that had happened, and it was basically to evoke the ghosts of a rally which you cannot see happening now. Can we be witnessing, or can we be with these revolutionary ideals? And I feel that is a step towards going somewhere in challenging these notions. When protesting itself has been co-opted, then what is protesting also has to be, I think, thought about or interrogated. And I feel that this challenge of trying to be with, like, if we are being with a particular moment and we are saying there were good things and there were bad things, but for me, this kind of criticality is a sign of respect, that it could do better, it could be something else. So being with the ghost of a moment or with a rally or with a revolutionary moment is also to be able to work with it. And I don't know if it's making sense. I don't know if I'm answering the question. And if Frida, Kunika, Thomas, anyone wants to join, I don't know. Yeah, but the intention of being with a moment, for instance, or trying to reflect on it is also trying to be with its ideal. And for us, that by default also means to go beyond, to be with the witnesses and witnessing the witnesses. Yeah, I don't know if it makes sense.
Okay, thank you very much. We have to wrap up by 4:15, so I suspect what might make sense, and it would be to go to Sophie, Asisipho, and then end up with Thatshisiwe. Okay. So is there anybody else from the group of four who would like to come on?
No, I think we can skip.
Okay. Sorry, we're just a little, but you sure? If you'd like to, we can. Others, I'm sure, would curtail. Should we? Okay, so let's move on to Sophie then.
Yeah, so what is remembering different histories, how does that help us think about potential futures and futures yet to come? I mean, I think, again, just to think about this from the specificity of the Lebanese context, but I think this applies elsewhere. I think, so I did the field work for my PhD at a time when the left was seen as a very outdated and idealistic thing in Lebanon, and where people were moving towards a kind of pragmatic, technocratic, managerial approach to politics, where, you know, the idea of, for example, the working classes revolting was seen as an impossibility. And I think what I've come to think is that part of the reason why these things feel impossible is because the memory of working class revolt or anti-sectarian collaborations among the working class, that memory just doesn't exist because the work of archiving and disseminating these stories hasn't been done. So I think it's really about forcing a rethinking of what is possible by being confronted with what was once possible or with what once existed. So I guess that's the way in which I think the past is useful. But I also think the reason why I think that the idea of debt is useful is because I think, to affectively connect with people who died for liberation struggles that have been abandoned, I think forces like us to reckon with how we move through the present and what we do and do not do in the present and the ways in which we're complicit with the perpetuation of the status quo. And I think connecting to, and I think, part of the way that I want to develop this in my work is to actually think about this through more of a spiritual lens because of sort of traditions of engaging with the question of ancestry within the Arab world. So I think that this is also a tradition that already exists culturally and that can be tapped into, I think. And on the question of the word return, I thought that was very beautiful, this idea of the ocean and going backwards and forwards and how do you measure return? And I think, this is again why I'm interested in affect, because the figures that I'm trying to look at aren't figures where, I'm trying to argue that we should return to their work, but people are just organically returning to their work. And that's why I started with that, the discussion of the graffiti on the walls of Beirut to read Mehdi Amen. And so I think that's almost sort of my starting point of what is it that has kind of organically driven people back to the work, but also the ethos of figures that otherwise had been forgotten. So I don't have the answer to the question because it's kind of my starting point, I suppose. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think what we'll do now is have, I hope, quick wrap-up comments from first Asisipho and then Thatshisiwe. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. I think to respond quickly to Kuzwayo on whether the liberation movements are likely to die. I think that will depend on the attitude of the liberation movement themselves that are in power. With the signs that have been given, the ANC is sitting on 40%. The signs of liberation movement, the symptoms of death are there that we've seen in the liberation movements. When they reach 20 years, there begins to be symptoms that ultimately that lead to a death. So the symptoms are there. And I think the most bold symptom speaks to the 40%. But however, whether they will die or not die, it depends on the attitude and how they respond to the issues that are raised by the people. On the issue of former President Kgalema Motlanthe on whether it must die to come back, I'm not sure. It has never demonstrated the ability to reclaim its hegemony where it has lost hegemony successfully. So I'm not sure about that, but it all depends on what becomes their attitude. And most importantly as well, we've seen in the Burkina Faso recently, the people themselves must be able to shape up and say, this is the kind of leadership we want and the kind of society we want. On Zanon, fully agree. I fully agree your views are at home. And even Grume in the 1960s spoke of what he called indigenous bourgeois that served the interest of the external bourgeois. So I'm fully aligned with what we're saying in the theoretical grounding of Fanon. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I didn't have a question now, but I forgot to respond to Ubaba's comment on the Domestic and Master Servant Act. I think I really appreciate that. And for me, it was this intergenerational co-construction of memory again, because it's something that really, throughout this research and working through this paper, I never came across and I never looked at. And it makes sense when you look at the anger that these people have and how they they express their anger as freedom, because that's one thing that they were not allowed to express. So I thank you for that, and I think it will be very useful for me, even in my future works, to engage with that when I look at the people that I'm looking at. And one thing, the paper was published in Social Identities Journal. I encourage you guys to read it. It's more interesting than how I presented it here, so you enjoy it. Thank you.
Okay, is that okay? So I want to start off by thanking the panelists. And this was a very diverse panel, but in a way that's been quite surprising. There have been powerful resonances across the presentations. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the audience for participating actively. And again, thanks to the SWAP team for putting it all together.